Chapter 5. Fort William Henry. Hawkeye ran from the forest. Chingachgook and Uncas followed him. There was a fight. Hawkeye, Uncas, and Duncan killed 4 Hurons. Chingachgook jumped on Magua. The Mohican stabbed Magua with his knife. Magua fell to the ground. Hawkeye and Duncan went and helped the 2 women. But Magua was not dead. He got up and ran away. Chingachgook and Uncas ran after him. "Stop!" shouted Hawkeye. "You cannot catch him!" "Hawkeye, how did you find us?" Duncan asked. "We waited at the side of the river," said Hawkeye. "We saw the Hurons take you across the river. Then we followed you." "You saved my life," said Duncan. Hawkeye smiled. "I found a Huron's gun," he said. "The Hurons were stupid. They left their guns under the trees." Hawkeye went back to the trees. He picked up the other guns. He found his own long gun. "Now we have guns and bullets," he said. "We will stay here tonight. Tomorrow we will go to Fort William Henry." Very early the next morning, Hawkeye woke his friends. He led them across the valley and along a path through the forest. They stopped near a small river. "We will walk in the water," said Hawkeye. "Then Magua will not see our footprints on the ground." They walked in the river for an hour. Then they came to some mountains. "Walk quietly now," said Hawkeye. "There are French soldiers here." They walked to the top of a mountain and looked down. There was Lake Horican, and there was Fort William Henry. Smoke came from fires in the forest. "Look at the fires," said Hawkeye. "There are many Hurons in the forest. They are fighting for the French." "And look to the west," said Duncan. "Look at those tents. That is General Montcalm's camp. There are thousands of French soldiers." Suddenly they heard the sound of guns. "The French are shooting at Fort William Henry," said Duncan. "But we must get into the fort." "We are lucky," said Hawkeye. "Thick fog is coming along the valley. The fog will hide us from the French. Follow me." Hawkeye and the Mohicans started to walk down the mountain. Duncan and the 2 sisters followed them. At the bottom of the mountain, the fog was very thick. "Be careful," said Hawkeye. "There are many French soldiers along this path. Walk quietly." They followed him through the fog. Suddenly they heard voices. "Who is there?" said a soldier in French. Duncan replied in French. "A friend of France," he said. "Who are you?" shouted the Frenchman. But Duncan and his friends walked away quickly. They went on through the fog. At last they arrived at the walls of the fort. An English voice shouted from the top of the wall. "The French are here! Shoot! Shoot!" "Father! Father!" Alice shouted. "It is us! Save your daughters!" "Don't shoot, men!" said the voice of General Monroe. "My daughters are here! Open the gates!" The gates opened. Soldiers came out of the fort. They took everybody inside. Duncan, the young women, Hawkeye, and the Mohicans. But everybody in Fort William Henry was in danger. Chapter 6. When will help come? Days passed. The French army fired their big guns at Fort William Henry. Many English soldiers were killed. General Monroe waited. But General Webb did not send any soldiers. Monroe sent Hawkeye to Fort Edward with a message. General Webb gave Hawkeye a letter for Monroe. The scout started to go back to Fort William Henry, but French soldiers stopped him. They took the letter. They tied Hawkeye's hands with rope. The next morning, Duncan Hayward was standing by the gates of Fort William Henry. He saw 3 men coming towards the fort. He went to General Monroe. "General Monroe," he said, "2 French soldiers are at the gates of the fort. Hawkeye is with them. But when will help come from Fort Edward?" Hawkeye came into General Monroe's room. "General Webb gave me a letter for you," he said, "but the French soldiers took it. General Montcalm wants to speak to you. You must go to his camp." A French officer met Monroe and Duncan at the gates of the fort. They went to General Montcalm's tent in the French camp. There were French officers and Indian chiefs in the tent. Then Duncan saw Magua. Magua was fighting for the French. The Huron looked at Duncan and smiled. Montcalm spoke first. He spoke to Monroe. "You have fought well, General," he said, "but now you must stop fighting." Montcalm gave a letter to Monroe. Monroe read it quickly. Then he gave it to Duncan. The letter was from General Webb. The letter said, "We cannot send any more men. The Indians have killed too many of my soldiers." Monroe looked at Duncan. They did not speak. Then General Montcalm spoke to Monroe. "You and your soldiers must leave Fort William Henry," he said. "You can take your guns, but do not take your bullets. Your men, women, and children will be safe, but we will burn the fort." General Monroe was unhappy. "We will leave in the morning," he said. Then he and Duncan went back to the fort. Magua was angry. He spoke to the Huron chiefs. "The English will leave the fort. The French will not kill them. But the English are the enemies of the Hurons. We will kill the English." 3,000 English people, soldiers, women, and children, left the fort. They walked past the French soldiers, and they walked towards the forest. The English soldiers carried their guns, but they had no bullets. Magua and the Hurons were standing in the forest. They watched Fort William Henry. The English left the fort and walked into the forest. Then 2,000 Indians attacked. The English could not fight. They had no bullets in their guns. Many of the English were killed. Alice and Cora saw their father. He was running towards the French camp. He was going to find Montcalm. He was going to ask for help. "Father! Father!" shouted Alice. "We are here!" But Monroe did not hear them. He did not stop. Magua was watching. He ran to Cora. "Will you come with me now?" he said. "Never," said Cora. "I will not be your wife." The Huron looked at her, but he did not speak. Then he turned to Alice. He held Alice's arms. He pulled her towards a horse. "Stop!" shouted Cora, and she ran after them. Magua put Alice on the horse. Then he put Cora on the horse too. The Huron took them along a path towards Lake Horican. Chapter 7. The Trail. 3 days had passed. Fort William Henry had burnt down. The French soldiers had gone. The Indians had gone. The bodies of many English soldiers, women, and children lay on the ground. In the evening, 5 men walked through the forest. Monroe, Duncan, Hawkeye, Chingachgook, and Uncas were looking for Cora and Alice. They found the dead bodies of many English people. The 5 men were sad and angry. Suddenly Uncas shouted to the others, "Look!" He had a small piece of cloth in his hand. "That is a piece of Cora's dress," said Monroe. Uncas found footprints on the ground near a tree. "3 people and a horse have stood here," he said. Then Chingachgook found Alice's necklace, and he found another piece of Cora's dress. Duncan took the necklace. He smiled. "Alice is alive," he said. "Miss Cora has left a trail," said Hawkeye. "She has left pieces of her dress. We can follow this trail, but we must go quietly. Magua is with them." "But it is late," said Hawkeye. "We will eat some food. We will sleep here tonight. Tomorrow we will follow Miss Cora's trail." Very early the next morning, Hawkeye woke the English officers and the Mohicans. The 5 men followed Cora's trail. It led them to Lake Horican. Uncas and Chingachgook found a canoe in the grass near the lake. The 5 men got into the canoe. The Mohicans paddled it along the lake. After half an hour, Uncas spoke quietly. "Smoke," he said. He was looking at a small island in front of them. "Smoke from a fire," said Hawkeye, "and there are 2 canoes." Suddenly some Hurons ran from the trees on the island. They got into the 2 canoes. "They are following us," said Duncan. "Paddle faster." "No, stop paddling, Chingachgook," said Hawkeye. "I will shoot them." And he lifted his long gun. He fired. A Huron in the first canoe fell into the lake. The Hurons stopped their 2 canoes. They did not follow. Chingachgook and Uncas started paddling again. The 5 men went on. They went north, up the lake. Chapter 8. The Medicine Man. In the evening, the 5 men arrived at the north end of Lake Horican. They got out of the canoe, and Uncas and Chingachgook carried it. They put it under some trees. "We have lost the trail," said Duncan. "Where shall we go?" "My Mohican friends know the path to the Hurons' village," said Hawkeye. "It is north of this place. That is where Magua is going. We will go north, too." For 2 days the men followed the path. They walked many miles. They arrived at the Hurons' village on the 2nd day. It was early evening. There were about 100 houses by a small lake. Hawkeye spoke to Chingachgook and Uncas. Then he spoke to Duncan and Monroe. "General Monroe, stay with Chingachgook," said Hawkeye. "Stay in the forest. Duncan and I will go into the village. Uncas, go up the hill to the west. Watch the village. Come back quickly. Tell us about the guards." An hour passed. The 4 men waited. Uncas did not come back. Suddenly Duncan spoke. I have a plan, he said. Hawkeye, give me your coat. I must not wear my red soldier's coat in the village. I will be a medicine man, a French doctor. I will speak French. I will walk through the village and go into the houses. The Hurons will not hurt a medicine man. I will find Alice and Cora. It was a dangerous plan. Duncan put on Hawkeye's coat. Then he walked into the Hurons' village. There was a large wooden building in front of him. It was the meeting house of the Huron chiefs. Duncan went inside. Some Huron chiefs were sitting together. They saw Duncan come in. One of the chiefs walked forward. His hair was gray, and he was tall and strong. He spoke to Duncan in the Huron language, but Duncan did not understand. "Do you speak French?" Duncan asked. The Huron replied in French. "Why are you here?" he asked. "I am a medicine man," said Duncan. "The King of France sent me. Are any Hurons ill?" Suddenly there were loud cries from the forest. The chiefs left the meeting house. Duncan followed them. More Hurons were coming into the village. There was a prisoner in front of them. It was Uncas.